welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens, and this is Carly Stevens Books from all things writing, publishing, and indie author life. Now, I am using a slightly different camera because my computer is happier with it for uploads. So bear with me during this. The reason that I am using this is that this video is bound to be longer than usual because I have lots and lots of thoughts. So buckle in. I'm going to be talking about whether or not reading classic literature can make you a better writer. At the end, I'm going to add a personal curriculum if you want to jump on that trend, which I think is a really lovely one of having a personal curriculum about something that you're interested in. So I will give you details about that at the end of this video. Few personal disclaimers as we talk about this topic. I do have a bachelor's in English, bachelor's degree. I taught high school level English for over a decade. So that's writing and literature and grammar and spelling and speaking and, every important communication kind of skill there. So that's really where I'm coming from. Despite spending so much time in the English literature academia zone, I don't fall on either extreme of pro-intellectualism or anti-intellectualism. Those arguments, I think, both tend to miss the mark. Personally, I think that literary fiction and quote unquote genre fiction, like romance and sci-fi and things like that, have different purposes that they serve, and often people miss each other because they're judging on a different scale than the other person is actually judging their own work against. It's not what this video is about, but I just wanted to clear the air and not say that I'm an apologist for all this, intellectual property being significantly more valuable than some more popcorn style reads. Anyway, I have read a lot in the Western canon. That really is that was my bread and butter in my classes and such. So because of that, there are going to be a lot of white English guys on this list because my education was really heavy with them both in high school and college as a Brit Lit major. I recognize this. Please give me some grace. I'm working on it. I have read more diversely since then, but I've studied primarily the American and British classic, canonical writers. So, of course, that does tend to be white men because of history. And personally, my final personal disclaimer is that I have personally published both quote unquote highbrow literary works like Laertes, which I love so dearly. This is a dark academia Hamlet retelling set in 1920s Paris, as well as quote unquote lowbrow works. So, under a different name, I write really, really spicy, unhinged fantasy romance. So, just be aware, I like both. I'm not coming from a strong position of you have to read classics. Now, I don't think you do have to read the classics to be a good writer. However, I am going to make the argument that there are things that you can learn, that you can glean from classic literature that I think can help writers in any genre take beautiful, shiny things home with them and improve their style and a lot of different aspects. So, a few more disclaimers because this is a topic that has a lot of kind of underlying baggage with it and such. So let's just get the elephant in the room out of the room. In classic literature, which is such a broad term, it really spans, over so many centuries and countries and stuff. So I'm speaking in the broad scheme of classic literature. There are pitfalls, like, of course, the rampant isms of earlier and present times. So I'm saying that there is, an assumption of certain races, certain genders being above and better and more powerful than the others. Obviously, if you've read much classic literature from the 15, 16, 17, 18, 1900s, yesterday, you've probably run into some of those issues. I am not going to pretend like that isn't there. Denying the existence of those evils does a disservice to anybody affected by it, which should be all of us. But I think to censor books like Frankenstein and David Copperfield and Their Eyes Were Watching God, because in different ways they portray prejudice or include prejudice. I think if you censor those things, it doesn't allow us to A, see for ourselves what living in that place at that time was like, typically, and from that unique perspective. B, I don't think it lets us acknowledge that injustice and disrespect. And C, um, we can endeavor with this added historical understanding of problems like sexism and racism to change those things in present day, armed with more detail than we have right in front of us on a daily basis. And then finally, if we censor books like that, I think that we D, lose the opportunity to glean the good parts of a book that has stood the test of time for one reason or another. Now, there is a point past which I think it's no longer worthwhile to read a book, but it is worthwhile, I think, to at least educate ourselves on what's out there and what made this popular both at the time and in the generations since. So, yes, call out prejudice, but mine what techniques and insight you can from the rest of the book. Okay, another thing that kind of comes to mind when people think of classic literature is the difference in pacing. Pacing expectations were very different in the 1800s, say, versus today. Today, we're battling a lack of attention span. People can look up anything with the push of a button. Herman Melville in Moby Dick took an unbelievably long time describing the dimensions and kinds of whales that exist to immerse the audience in the experience of seeing, harpooning, and ultimately dismantling whales. We, the modern audience, don't necessarily need or want this level of explanation. But without those explanations, without that detail, most people wouldn't be able to picture whales accurately at all at the time because there wasn't that same access to information. Victor Hugo in Les Miserables creates a tapestry of French history and experience that expects the reader to sit back, relax, and absorb a ton of information that is not immediately relevant to the plot. Current writers often achieve immersiveness through things like deep POV. I have a video about that, and sometimes world building. But older authors, like authors of many generations past, often pass down knowledge of their community and such through passages in their books. So if you're thinking this is quite the slow burn at times, then yes, sometimes that is true of the classics, quote unquote, but not of um, necessarily all of them, but do be aware that you're going to run into pacing that you're not used to. It's going to go a little bit more slowly, or it's going to take a while to get to the good part as opposed to cutting to the chase. Classic literature expects a lot from its audience typically. It expects you to understand the complex ideas, it expects you to keep track of characters, figure out what the takeaway is. This is, in general, of course, tons of classic books, and they're all different. I keep seeing a lot of people coming away from R.F. Kuang's Catabasis, which, as I make this video, just recently came out a few weeks ago. And they're saying that it is above their current reading level. The average reading level of adults in America is relatively low. Most adult traditionally published books they aim for a sixth grade reading level. They're written pretty simply. And I have books that I've written simply. I'm not going to say that that is necessarily an evil thing all the time, but it does speak to the um, expectation of having information, fed to you and being reminded of things rather than putting some of those pieces together, which classic literature generally expects you to be able to do. But That's fine if you are somebody who has kind of a lower reading level just because you haven't challenged yourself or what have you. That's perfectly fine. You can actually improve your reading level bit by bit. It's like weight training. That's a great analogy, it seems to me. At first, it seems really difficult and like a slog, and you're like, this is so uncomfortable. But if you persist and you grow bit by bit with your practice, then it'll become easier and easier. And the stuff that you're reading that before would have been all but opaque is suddenly becoming as vivid as a book that was written yesterday. And it opens up these vistas of really cool options, some of which I'm going to be sharing with you in later parts of this video. The titles I'm going to suggest for the personal curriculum, should you wish to read some of these and come away with shiny things to use in your own work, are not expert level books. So fear not. I have you in mind. I found some of the things that I find not only relatively comparatively easy to read and to understand, but with an element of potentially stretching you a little bit, but also ones that I find fun or interesting to read myself. So, like I said, I'll get there at the end. So, uh, my plan is to help you with that next step. If you do want your reading level to improve and you do want to kind of know what the classics are about and what you can use for your own use. So these books persist for a reason. They give insight into what it means to be human and express that in eloquent or unusual ways. This is true of the books that I love that are considered classics. This is true of the books that I do not love that are considered classics. We're still allowed to have opinions, of course. Uh, so, getting to that central question, can reading classics make you a better writer? I think there is a lot to be learned from the classics. I don't think it's necessary, but I think it can be a way to add all of these tools to your writer tool belt. And for me, especially somebody who loves so many different types of stories and wants to write a wide variety of stories, the more tools that I can have at my disposal to reuse in different ways, again, Frankenstein style, for my fantasy, my literary, my cottage core cozy, my spicy scenes. If I can take some of these things, then I become a better writer overall because of what I've learned from these others. So, allow me to share some of the things that I think you can also learn and take away if you want to read a few classics, figure out what the deal is, and use some of their techniques as your own. So, for example, one of the things that I think is really cool with the classics that I didn't realize until I stopped reading the classics and started reading only contemporary, recent publications is that the plot lines aren't as predictable. Not only is it because there is a wide range, of course, of styles and eras and you know areas that these books come from, but they're just uh, well, traditional publishing now and before is a business. Therefore, it will only pick up books it's convinced will sell. With the rise of things like book talk, there are some positive aspects to book talk. And so please don't take this as a bash. Book talk has been really helpful for my writing career. And I think it is directly responsible for salvaging the likes of Barnes and Noble. However, there is a opposite side to that coin. A lot of the viral book marketing that is popular on Book Talk reduces books to trope lists, which makes sense. It's easily digestible. You can just glance at it and kind of see if there's something that you're interested in reading. And it's not only tropes at this point, but it's cliche lines. So I follow a lot of spicy romance authors, being one myself under that other name, right? And the number of times you see the really popular lines from the male main character included in a list, like good girl or who did this to you. It's like, okay, well, I've seen about 1,000 characters say that exact same line. Tropey books can be great. I mean, you look at Lord of the Rings and some of these things, they're filled with all these tropes. So tropey books are not the problem. I think they can be great if there's a fresh, authentic spin on them. But because of the popularity of authors who won the jackpot at the TikTok slot machine, many books are looking the same nowadays, or very similar, very predictable, almost boring to a point. And again, I'm just going to have a caveat with all these things. Sometimes predictability is part of the point in certain genres. So, in cozy fantasy, knowing that there's not going to be something truly terrible that happens. In rom coms, knowing that there's going to be a happily ever after at the end. There's comfort in that kind of predictability. But in across most genres, there is a certain level of predictability that seems to be on the rise, not with every book, but as a general trend. Classic literature breaks away from a lot of those things because, of course, the vast majority of it came out before there was that style of marketing and thinking about stories. Obviously, for millennia, there have been ways of considering what makes up a story, the idea of multiple act structure. And so it's not like it's complete chaos out there, but you do get more unexpected elements in classic books. So, because the classics cross time and culture, this shouldn't surprise us. These authors didn't need a social media presence and platform to be greenlit by authors. By the way, did you know that some classics are traditionally published, but others were self published in one way or another? The Inferno, fan fiction, Tale of Two Cities, self published in installments, so readers would stress out about what was going to happen next. I love it. So, if you want examples of what I'm talking about, these are some of these are expert level reads. So, this is not part of the curriculum suggestion, but if you want to have some examples of books that do have really unexpected directions that they go or ways that they tell the story, let me tell you about some of them. We have The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. It is ostensibly a murder mystery, but it's more a psychological portrait of a Russian family dealing with a crisis of faith and falling out. It is very long, but the characters are brilliant. And I personally, as I was reading, forgot it was a murder mystery. It just went in such a different direction than that. Hamlet, my beloved Hamlet, is really unexpected. A lot of what you'd expect to happen on page happens off page, which is not recommended as a strategy. But the choices that the characters make are not what you would anticipate in a tragedy. There's a lot of comedy in Hamlet. If you look at it, it's really funny. It has all the elements of multiple genres, and yet it ends up being a tragedy, of course, at the end. If you look at something like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, it's a children's story, ostensibly, but it includes a lot of poetry, a lot of chaos and mayhem and nonsense and really dark things that unexpectedly happen. And it's unlike any other kid lit that I've read. Even some of the weirder stuff, I don't know that it gets much weirder than Alice in Wonderland. It just goes in very unexpected directions for a kid lit portal fantasy. If you want to see a comedy go in really unexpected directions, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead is a play by Tom Stoppard, and it's about two minor characters in Hamlet, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and their sort of crisis of identity. It's a really funny play. It goes between having modern dialogue with a lot of questions and answers to old-timey Shakespearean dialogue when their day intersects with the goings on of the actual play of Hamlet. It's incredibly unusual. I've never seen anything quite like it. And then my last recommendation is Niebla by Miguel de Unamuno. It's translated mist if you're reading the English version, I believe. Excuse me, but Niebla is a novel that is really kind of difficult to describe. It's about a guy whose life starts going downhill and he wants someone to blame, and it becomes so meta, your mind will be blown. So, plot lines that aren't predictable, those are some examples. If you haven't read them before, feel free to check them out. Do know that Brothers Karamazov and Hamlet are definitely expert level reads. If you want to walk through Hamlet, though, I do have a scene by scene breakdown on my other channel, English Nerd, if you want to join me for that. Okay, something else that you can get from reading classics that I think you don't always get to the same degree in current literature is developing themes. Think about the papers that you wrote in high school, I assume, or college. So, a theme is a major idea, if you weren't already aware, that you consider in different ways in your story. It's connected to the takeaway. So, this can be something like love conquers all, or people are mysteries even to themselves, or war is hell, or something. So, this idea, and it could be multiple themes in a book, usually is, but this idea is central to what the book is kind of examining, even if you're not writing a book with a moral message or something. I mean, romance is love conquers all. That really is so much of what romance is about. But rather than just saying that at the end of a story, having developing that theme through multiple avenues is a lot of the way to elevate what you're what you're writing. So every book has a theme, whether you think it does or not. A well-crafted story in any genre often develops its theme in a variety of ways. The classics are famous for having these big ideas running through them and demonstrating these ideas in, through symbolism, through side characters, through subplots, through, a song that somebody sings, through the way that the story ends, through the character arcs, all of these different ways that the whole story itself really hangs together. It doesn't feel random. It feels like the whole thing has this integrity to it because there's a central idea or a few central ideas that really allow it to hang together. So consider 1984 by George Orwell. If you haven't read it, it's technically an easy read. It's by which I mean the language, the reading level is relatively low compared to a lot of other classics, but mentally, as you might assume from its reputation, if you haven't read it, it is really, really difficult to read. So let me walk you through how it develops one of its major themes, which is the evils of fascism. Rather than simply saying that fascism is evil, we see the theme developed and reinforced over and over again. Okay, this is the point where I tell you there are going to be spoilers for 1984. Jump ahead 2 minutes if you plan to read this book yourself, because I am staunchly anti spoiler. So if you're going to read it, spoilers are coming. Get out of here. Okay, I think they're gone. Okay, so from small unsettling hints like we get on the first page, literally on the first page, the clock strikes 13, which is considered in the US anyway to be an unlucky number. And then there's the dissonance of the place where Winston lives, which is called, I want to say Victory Manors. It's not that, it's something very, very similar. Victory Mansions being gritty and disgusting rather than glorious. To the massive injustices we see treated as everyday things, we get the point. Big Brother, the leader of the party, looms over everything as this figure who is worshipped and believed even when he overtly lies. Like we, the reader, can see that it's a lie, and yet people will just switch. Winston, who works at the Ministry of Truth, changes reports and history, that's his job, so that they align with what the current leader is saying. In the middle of the story, they switch the nation that they're at war with in the middle of a week of political celebrations. And everyone is shocked to find that all the posters don't have the correct enemy nation on them because again, they just believe completely blindly even when there is a massive amount of cognitive dissonance at the end. Orwell just does not, he's so mean. He hammers the point home by showing the main character, Winston Smith, who has just begun to take some tiny steps in opposition to the party. He gets arrested without a trial and tortured. He's so brainwashed in the Ministry of Peace that he says at the end of the book that he loves Big Brother. At that point, we don't need there to be a statement that fascism is evil. We need to just have read the book. And all of these hints, everything that happens is making that point. It's developing that theme in the most devastating way. We're meant to be horrified by this book. Like I was the first time I read it, and it was the worst ending I could have imagined, and I wanted to throw the book across the room. I would have preferred if he perished without coming to the conclusion that he loved Big Brother. So we're meant to see all this. We're meant to say, oh, okay, I see. This is the big idea that the whole book's been working with. Fascism is evil, and I don't want this to happen in my time. So there's a theme and there's a takeaway. Okay, so far we've talked about how plot lines aren't as predictable in many cases if you read the classics. The people who write books that stand the test of time tend to be excellent at developing universal human themes that do stand that test of time. And then number three is widening vocabulary. This is something that classics are really good at doing. And by the by, a lot of middle grade books. What an unsung hero that is the middle grade books of the world. They tend to have pretty decent vocabulary, but of course, so do the classics. They can widen your vocabulary and therefore your ability to understand and express more ideas. It's not just this additional word, but often along with the words, you get a different concept or you get a new connotation or shade of meaning onto something that you thought you fully understood before. So, going back to 1984, one of the ways that the party keeps control of the populace in that novel is to reduce vocabulary. It's a concerted effort. Language becomes simpler. Who needs synonyms, right? The thing is, the larger a vocabulary you have, the more ideas you can express. And so the party in that book is trying to reduce the amount of ideas people can express and therefore think, which is so sinister. So synonyms are important, actually. They're rarely an exact one-for-one meaning. The dictionary definition can be the same, but the connotations are going to vary. So that is, that additional kind of association apart from the dictionary definition. An example that a scholar gives in the book 1984 is the word good. Who needs splendid, wonderful, great when you have good? Or if you want to make it intense, you could say plus good. Now, those have different associations with them. They might be kind of small, but there is so much you can do with this small nuance of words. So, a greater vocabulary adds to your tool belt of communication. That can only be a good thing. In my literary fiction, Laertes, I use a vast vocabulary. But for my spicy romantasy, I keep it fast, I keep it simple, I keep it at that easier reading level. The reason is the purpose that I have for the different books. But that's again not the point of this video. Suffice it to say, I think you should use whatever vocabulary will best help you tell your story and give readers the experience you want them to have. So a couple of authors you can look at, there are lots of them, excuse me, if you want to widen your vocabulary, are Virginia Woolf or William Shakespeare. Shakespeare came up with a lot of the vocabulary in the English language. When he didn't have something that he wanted to express, he just invented it, and more power to him. Okay, another is narrative voice. Narrative voice is something that is extremely important to writing in general. Writing today, writing of yesteryear. If you want to be picked up by a traditional publisher, an agent, one of the major things that they look for is a strong narrative voice. I did a whole video on voice if you want to learn more about my personal thoughts on that and how you can improve your voice, even though the discourse around it tends to be like, oh, it's the X factor. Okay, well, how do you improve the X factor? What does that mean? So narrative voice is something that traditional publishers say that they're looking for, but I would argue that this is another aspect of story that has also become, and this is not unusual, but it's become a little bit homogenous. I'm not saying that as a blanket statement of all books. Let's appreciate the nuance of it all. But have you noticed that a lot of books kind of sound the same? Certain characters feel like they're kind of Control C, Control V, a little bit. Oh, it's this character, but in a different outfit. Or the storytelling narrative voice is, oh, it's this. I know this person. It's in a different outfit. So if you want to kind of refresh the ways that you can consider voice, the classics have lots of different options. So for this section, I separated out my recommendations into aspects or types of voice that you might be interested in looking at, listening to. So yeah, there's a wide array of original voices and fresh language. So if you want unreliable narrators, I love an unreliable narrator, one that you can't fully trust. Usually it's a first person narrator in a mystery or a thriller, and you are not sure to what degree you can trust what's being told to you. So some of my favorite unreliable narrators that you can check out are the In the Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, or The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. So those are all pretty creepy books. If you want to read some of those, in fact, a couple of those make my curriculum list at the end of this video. For Halloween, I recommend them. So the Yellow Wallpaper in particular, if I had to choose one of those three to recommend, it would be Yellow Wallpaper all the way. It's easy to read. It's about a woman who is going insane, and you cannot necessarily trust her eyes, her perception. If you're looking for more unusual voices, different styles of narration that you do not see as often in current literature that you just want to check out to see maybe if you want to use an aspect of that or just broaden your horizons a little bit, then there is Flowers for Algernon. My gosh, by Daniel Keyes. There we go. Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes is the story of a man with a very low IQ who is writing journal entries as he's been accepted into this experimental experiment to raise his IQ. The problem is he is the first human subject. Algernon is a mouse that was the first living subject to increase intelligence. So the narrative style of this is entirely journal entries, certainly in the short story, I think in the novel version as well. But it starts out with every kind of misspelling and misunderstanding, and it's hard to slog through because it's clearly written by somebody who is unintelligent, who doesn't really understand what's going on, who's unable to express himself and is not very educated. And then as the story continues, you see his intelligence level begin to rise, and with that, his ability to express his ideas in written form. I'm not going to give away what happens exactly, but it's another one of those stories that doesn't necessarily go the way you expect it to go. So unusual voices. We've got Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. We have Beowulf, Anonymous, which is the Anglo-Saxon. Most people call it an epic poem. Tolkien you can see my stuff behind me there, called it an elegy, so kind of a sorrowful work. But if you're looking for a very noble, high sounding, things are being taken very seriously kind of voice, then Beowulf is a great place to go. Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury is another beautiful book. It's another dystopian book like 1984, but it's not quite as heart-wrenching about citizens censoring their own books and the effect that it has, to burn books rather than to read them despite the ambiguous messages that they come across. So the reason that I added this to the voices category is that Ray Bradbury has this very distinctive manner of narrating, of course, that includes a lot of things like synesthesia, which is an unusual literary device that describes one sense in terms of another. So his writing is really vivid, it's really figurative, it's a bit of a trip, but I highly recommend reading a little bit, at least, of Ray Bradbury. He wrote about a million short stories, so you can always grab one of those and get a sense of what I'm talking about right away. And then the unusual voices, last one on that list is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. Their Eyes Were Watching God is from the perspective of a Black woman who is navigating a very prejudiced society. She gets married quite young, and it's her journey of self fulfillment, I guess, against the odds. The narrative style is, of course, not excuse me, not only coming from a minority voice, but it's also written in some dialect as well. I would say check it out. I would not say start writing in dialect yourself. It's definitely murky waters for people who don't specifically come from that dialect themselves. So just caution there. But it's a beautifully written and really sad book. So there we go. If you want to hear about some lyrical prose, you can always skip ahead a little bit if you don't want these voice recommendations, but they're just so good. I love voice. So if you want some lyrical prose that makes your writing sound beautiful, that really pays attention to the music of just the way sentences go. I'm sure you've read books that have that. I think about Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor on my shelf back there. She's a YA author who's of course still writing now. She has incredibly lyrical prose, but some of my recommendations for lyrical prose in the classics, Lord of the Flies by William Golding. It is a a story about a boys' school who their plane crashes on this deserted island and they have to form a society. But the language, the lush setting is so beautifully described, even though the boys just talk like normal people. They're not speaking musically per se, but the narrative voice is just decadent, it seems to me, despite the horrible things that end up very quickly, as you can imagine, going on. The Awakening by Kate Chopin is another. That one is an early feminist work about a woman who feels caught in her marriage. She feels trapped and of course it's another dealing with prejudice kind of story. I'm trying to remember exactly where it's set. I literally haven't reread the whole thing since high school, but I have a vivid memory of the just heat soaked atmosphere. I want to say it's around New Orleans. It's in Louisiana somewhere. And it's like turn of the century Louisiana. So you can imagine just how, again, lush this is. It's really beautifully written. The Wind in the Willows, if you want something that's less depressing than either of the previous ones. The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame is, of course, a children's story, children's classic. And it's where you get characters like Mr. Toad, who is kind of unimportant in that book, to be honest. He shows up at the end. But you have Rat and Mole, and the language is beautiful. It's so lyrical. And then finally, I was about to end the list, and then I remembered the picture of Dorian Gray. Ah, it is like dark academia dream. It's by Oscar Wilde. And the picture of Dorian Gray is a very creepy story. It's also really decadent. I mean, it feels like you're eating dark chocolate and misbehaving when you're reading this book. But it is about Dorian Gray, of course, who is a young, beautiful man who decides that to stay young and beautiful, he is willing to sell his soul. So he kind of makes a deal with the devil in a way and exchanges his soul for eternal youth and beauty. So his soul goes into this portrait, this beautiful portrait that has just been painted of him. And from then on out, he has no soul. And this portrait begins to show the effects of sin and cruelty. And it's just a treat. And then finally, just a handful of introspective and intense narrative voices. If you struggle with some introspection or interiority of your characters, their thought processes and feelings and making those complex, then here are some stories I would recommend that have a really strong narrative voice and focus heavily on that side of the character, the psychological side of the character. My first recommendation, and this is another pretty expert level choice, but one of my favorite books, even though it's tough, is Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. It is about an axe murderer, and you're in his head the vast majority of the time. It's a portrait of his trying to get away with it and wrestling with the why of it. It's really a why done it rather than a who done it. You're trying to figure out what was his motivation for this the whole time, even though you're in his head through the entire experience. Because that happens so early on in the story, it's not even really a spoiler. Excuse me. The Lady in the Looking Glass by Virginia Woolf is another one. I'm seeing how dark the lighting is in here. Good gracious, terrible. I thought it was a bit better. Oh well, I'll lighten it up, I guess. The Lady in the Looking Glass by Virginia Woolf is a really short story that is somebody who's watching a lady in a looking glass and assuming things about her life. Again, it's introspective and intense. And then the final recommendation in this category is The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, about a butler named Stevens, no relation, who has served this family his entire life with everything he has. He has done everything as perfectly and professionally and as disinterestedly and dispassionately as he can muster. And yet here he is toward the end of his life wrestling with the potential of regrets. Did he worked hard, he followed the rules. Was there anything he missed? And it is, again, introspective and intense. And then the last benefit, I think, from reading classics that I'll talk about in this video anyway, is illusions, being able to spot illusions, being able to use illusions. So, an illusion is a passing reference to something well known. So, the most common ones in the Western canon are going to be biblical allusions, mythological allusions, and then Shakespearean allusions. The assumption is that many people come into these works with a baseline knowledge of these three things. So having access to these illusions is like having access to shorthand. It's like having a conversation or inside jokes with the past. You share some of the same mental furniture. So what you can do is you can go straight to the source if you do want to understand more of those references that crop up constantly in classics. So you can read Macbeth for, it's so often alluded to, the Shakespearean play Macbeth. You can read the Gospel of John. There are four Gospels at the beginning of the New Testament, and you can pick one and learn about, the miracles of Christ and some of those things that are alluded to very, very often in Western literature. Or you could read a mythologically based work like Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey. Again, those are books that come up very often in classics. So you can go straight to the source, or you can read allusion heavy works, ideally with footnotes or something like that. You don't need to read every footnote, but if you're trying to increase your understanding and ability to use allusions as a sort of shorthand, then having those footnotes can be helpful. So Dante's Inferno is nothing but allusions. It's fan fiction with allusions. Obviously, it's a brilliant work. It does have some problematic bits to it. If you're interested in walking through Dante's Inferno, I do also have a canto by canto walkthrough of that on my other channel, English Nerd, if you want to join me there. It's one of the books that I taught every year to the 10th grade. And of course, there was something that happened 5 years ago that didn't allow me to be in class while I was teaching it. So I had to create these lessons, but it really is helpful for people who are just encountering these books for the first time, because I talk about what happens, some of the symbolism and background, and some things to get out of it, which include a lot of allusions. You can also read the poem by T.S. Eliot called The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. That one is definitely an expert level read. If you're not used to reading poetry, this one's going to just throw you for an absolute loop. But it is a blast to start digging through The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Again, I did a video on that on my other channel, English Nerd, if you want to really challenge yourself and read this poem. It's about 4 pages long, so not long, but it's weird. It's very weird, but once you start getting a handle on how to pick it apart, how to kind of make connections and things, it becomes like this treasure hunt. I love that poem. And then my final recommendation that has a lot of biblical allusions in it is the poem Carrion Comfort. Carrion, like, a dead animal kind of a thing. Carrion Comfort by Gerard Manley Hopkins, who was going through a pretty intense crisis of faith, and he was battling depression. It's an incredibly moving poem. It's like maybe half a page long, and it also has an unusual use of language. It's a poem, so I didn't include it in the voice section because I wanted to focus on prose. If you're writing a book, you're writing a story, but that one is good if you want to spot some of those allusions and how they're used as well. So, studying classic literature has helped me in a few specific ways. My writing style is not solely inspired by classic literature. It's evolved, it's continued to evolve. I've learned from the likes of Maggie Stiefvater and Jonathan Stroud and Sarah Kate and all these people who write in a vast array of different genres. And so these are some of the things that I took from more classic authors. So I had them earlier on. So, for example, using line and paragraph breaks to strategic effect, like poetry does, I am quite aware as an English teacher where a line cuts off if it's poetry, especially when it's not a sonnet or something that needs to be square shaped, but instead it's a little more free flowing. Where the line breaks off is a lot of what the poetry is using to get its point across. And so, as a prose writer, being aware of where a line cuts off or how much white space I have on one side for the reader's eyes to kind of rest on, that is something that I picked up from studying the classics, from studying poetry and literature and things like that. I actually have a whole video on this channel about using white space and word placement, and I really got into my English teacher zone like I'm doing right now. I need to occasionally. I quit my English teaching job a year and a half ago now, which is absolutely wild to say. And I miss some of the teaching part of it. So thanks for indulging me here. Something else that classic literature specifically helped me with is developing the theme of my first book, my first series. So this is the first book in the Tan Yuan Academy series. This was my debut. It's a YA dark twisty epic fantasy about a guy who gets into an elite academy for mental warriors, and he's willing to do anything at all to be the best, even bad things. So I knew not exactly what was going to happen throughout the entire series, but I knew how I wanted Furion to change, what I wanted him to learn. And a lot of it centered around this theme that great literature and current literature that is good but hasn't had time to prove itself over the decades uh, has taught me is to develop themes in different ways, right? With side characters, with all these different things, like in 1984 and how fascism is evil. So the theme in Tanyuan Academy series, among a couple others that I really wanted to hone in on and hold up to the light like a prism, is the idea of domination versus selflessness, which I examined really closely in a lot of works by Dostoevsky, actually, about how love is selflessness and not domination. That's the true polarity rather than love and hate, which I thought was really interesting, and I incorporated into my book. And then the final thing that I put down as a concrete way that classic literature has helped my particular writing is that I have a relatively historical understanding of vocabulary. I know this is pretty, like, you'd have to do more reading of literature to kind of get to the point where you have a sense of when words started to come to be. But because I studied the classics, it allowed me to write like I'm in the 1920s with Laertes, because I knew what the 1920s kind of sounded like. Is it flawless? I don't think so. Is it very good? I think yes. um, or I can sound like I'm in the 1800s, which is yet a different sort of sound as well. So I have a gothic horror story that I forgot to grab and pull over here, but it's called To Have Had So Much Blood. And it's about a haunted Scottish manor. And I wanted it to sound like it was in the 1800s, and I wanted it to look like it was in the 1800s. And I've read enough books for the vocabulary and the sentence structure to kind of imitate that. So if you write historical, it is important, I think, to read in that historical period to get the flavor of it. Sometimes there's an intangible thing about it. Like if you read a lot of books by American authors, a lot of books by British authors, a lot of books by Russian authors. So those are the three big ones that I've read. There's this like undeniable flavor to them all, and I'm not even sure that I can quite pin it down, but it's one of those like I'm fairly sure when I see it type of a thing. And so if you're writing historical, do yourself a favor and make sure that you're reading in that time period as well. Okay. So after having said all that, what would I recommend for a short personal curriculum? So I put together like a 5-week thing. I know 6 weeks would have made a bit more sense, but this gives you some wiggle room. There's no problems there. So this is a short personal curriculum for somebody wanting to read classics for the first time so they can grow as a writer. So I know that's pretty specific, but I assume that that's a lot of you, especially those who are still here at the end of the video. So if you want, I've mentioned a few step-by-step deep dives into different pieces of literature on my other YouTube channel, English Nerd, that's not really active at the moment. I post like a couple videos a year at this point. Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens is on there. So if you want to challenge yourself with a full-on novel, that is one that I love. Yes, it has, like things that I would kind of do differently myself, but there are just brilliant parts to it, characters that I continue to love. Feel free to head over there. The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock is on there. Carrie Comfort, I do a full-on analysis of that. Hamlet, scene by scene. But you don't have to do those things. Here is the 5-week recommended curriculum. Okay, week 1 is short story week. I have 3 short stories that I recommend that you read during this first week. The first one is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. It's a horror story in the form of journal entries. I mentioned this earlier. It is peak unreliable narrator, and it's a critique of women's mental health quote unquote care, certainly at the time. And I think some of those concerns continue to be relevant today. It's a wonderful, creepy story that is also a pretty easy read. It's very accessible for people who have not studied a bunch of English stuff like I have. Second short story that I added to the curriculum is The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. It's basically psychological horror. I want to call it slasher horror, but I guess there's only a limited amount of slashing that happens. And that one is intense. We've got another horror story. Halloween is around the corner. And so if you've never read that one, do yourself a favor and definitely do. The last one is creepy as well. I kept them all creepy for you, so it can all be themed. And that is The Chaser by John Collier. This one I think is not quite at the literary level of the previous ones, but it's super easy to read in one sitting. It's like maybe 5 pages long, super short, and it is a lesson in subtext. It's not it's not difficult like the subtext you get from Hemingway, for example. I personally struggle to find the subtext in Hemingway. He's like a sheer wall, and I had struggled to find the crack to kind of open it up. This story uses subtext in a way that doesn't tell you how you should feel at the end, but there are all these clues. It's like great for foreshadowing, to help you figure things out at the end. So very helpful for that. Okay, week 2 is Poetry Week. Poetry Week does not have a ton of poems, and all of them are short. I'm looking out for you. But these can help you with vocabulary, they can help you with lyricism, they can help you with original analogies, all kinds of really fun stuff. Okay, I'm going to start off with one of my favorite poets, and that is John Donne. He lived in the early 1600s. So don't be too freaked out by that. I chose some of his most accessible poems. I guess the second one is a little bit more obtuse, but you can figure it out. You've got this. So I have two to recommend. You can pick your poison. Option 1 is the more famous Death Be Not Proud sonnet, Death Be Not Proud, for the ones who want a shorter, a little bit clearer sonnet. Maybe you don't like explicit things. If you're like, give me the salacious poetry, then the other option is To His Mistress Going to Bed. That one is smexy, let me tell you. So I like that about John Donne. He has these holy sonnets, and then he has these just explicit poems as well, certainly explicit for the time, and still pretty explicit today. So Death Be Not Proud or To His Mistress Going to Bed. John Keats is the next poet up. You have two choices here as well. The first is To Autumn, which is another sonnet. Sonnets are only 14 lines, so very, very short. If you want to get better at lyrical settings, Keats's use of sound is insane. So he uses things like alliteration, which is that repetition of a particular sound, to imitate, the hush of a breeze through grasses, or the idea of being sleepy or being stressed, or he's just very, very good. So To Autumn, if you're feeling very autumny and you want that lyrical setting, or Ode to a Nightingale. He has a few very famous odes. There's like Ode on a Grecian Urn. I prefer Ode to a Nightingale myself. I think it's sexier, and it's a masterful use of sound, once again, with some passionate interiority. Again, if you're struggling with writing down complex thoughts, this is very, am I waking or dreaming? And it's quite dark, the subject matter of Ode to a Nightingale compared to Autumn, but there you go, two different choices. Maya Angelou is my next recommendation. And for that, I would go with her most famous poem, Still I Rise. This one's going to be easily the easiest poem to read of the bunch and to understand, except for maybe Frost. He's super easy to read as well. But this one is more free flowing. You don't have the same level of rhyme and structure. And so you can pay attention more to the analogies and things that she's using in her poem. Next up is Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson, who was the original M Dash lover. So I recommend I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died. Dark, yes, but we're here in the classics, everyone, and a lot of them are going to be dark. But again, this is a short poem. It uses a lot of dashes. Don't get too distracted by that. It's a fascinating look at, the looking at something tiny to represent something big. And this has been described as a great writing technique in general, too. Like if you're writing about battles, don't talk about how there were 14,000 people over here and only 10,000 over here. Talk about a child's shoe that was left on the path. Look at that small thing, and then that's going to really illuminate the big thing. And in this poem, I think that is a lot of what's going on. And then finally, Robert Frost. He's famous. He's an icon, and I would recommend stopping by the woods on a snowy evening. It's incredibly easy to read. It has this lovely lyricism to it, but it doesn't use a lot of complex words or anything. It's just putting them in a very nice and pleasing and peaceful order. So the more you see that kind of thing, and the more you read that, just very lyrical words, I think it gives you the ability to be a bit more conscientious in your own work about using certain sounds or certain sentence length or whatever when you're narrating your story. Okay, week 3 is drama week. Drama week, we're getting away from the darkness. Instead, we're going with Oscar Wilde, who was the writer of The Picture of Dorian Gray, his only novel, but he was really more known for his plays. So in week 3, you would read The Importance of Being Earnest. If you want to write witty banter, he's the king. He's the king of witty banter. He was the wittiest banterer in real life as well as in plays. There are also some excellent plot twists in this play. It's fairly short. It's very satirical if you want to criticize current, societal things. Oscar Wilde is all about that. And it's actually laugh out loud funny, even if you're just reading it to yourself. If you try reading, a Shakespeare play to yourself, chances are you're not going to be laughing. You're going to be trying to remember which character is who, and trying to tag, who's saying what. In this, I have literally had students sitting in study hall reading The Importance of Being Earnest and just cracking up. It's awesome. So we actually get a happy, laughing book for week 3. Again, it's fairly short. It is, you can find it by itself, published by itself, but easy to read in a week. It's 3 acts, I believe. And just brilliant, witty banter time. It's so good for dialogue and just smart wordplay. Okay, week 4. Week 4 is novella week. I don't assign in this curriculum that you can adjust however you want any long novels, because I want you to have time to do other things too. But you should be able to make time to read a novella in a week if this is your personal curriculum and it's this short-lived kind of intensive as you're studying these things, right? So for novella week, you're going to read Lord of the Flies by William Golding. It has a gorgeous island setting. It has a very clear theme that is developed throughout, of course, the entire story that remains relevant today about the tendencies of people to become their worst selves if there's not enough order, or especially if they're anonymous. It's quite a dark story, but that's again true of the majority of the classics. I gave you some happy ones though. And then finally, week 5 is epic. It's basically epic fantasy week. Epic fantasy, yes, that's right. I'm not having you read Lord of the Rings because that is a tome, and getting through that in a week, some people can do it. I can't. I remember it took me uh, about a week to read Two Towers and Return of the King. And I did like nothing. I went to school because I was in high school. Went to school, came home, did my homework, and I read Lord of the Rings. Any spare moment, I read Lord of the Rings. But anyway, that is not what I'm assigning. The final book that I'm assigning is Beowulf. I'm assigning this last because I think you need to build up to it a little bit. It has that noble style, that lofty, elevated voice. It is a poem. It's an epic poem. Well, it fits a lot of the epic criteria. We're not going to split hairs here. I'm just an English teacher thinking about it now. But it's an epic poem, but it's one of the shorter epic poems. It's not like the Iliad long, but it does include a lot of those epic conventions. And it elevates quote unquote silly or silly things like monster fights to feel universally relevant. So how can you use little or things that are easy to otherwise laugh at or push to the side? How can you make those really hit emotionally? So this is a fun book. It's a monster fighting book, but it takes itself very seriously. My favorite character shows up at the end. If you read it and if you know who I'm talking about, please put his name in the comments. Yeah, I've he's my favorite in the story for sure. Okay, if you made it to the end, thank you so much for sticking around. I know this was a long, complex video without a ton of stuff to look at. I'm sure a lot of you just treated this like a podcast, and that's perfectly fine. In the description down below, I did include the recommended curriculum as well as some of the notes that I used to create this video for you. If you have any other suggestions, if you've read a classic work that you think has either helped you in one particular way or you think could help other people in a particular way, please put that down in the comments below. I have tons of thoughts on this and lots of other books that I could recommend. If this is something you do want to add to your winter personal curriculum and you'd rather finagle it yourself, check out, like I said, my other channel, English Nerd. I have lists of the easiest to read, the kind of ways into, strategies to begin reading the classics and a variety of other videos like that. Or you could just choose one of my big playlists, like follow me and read A Tale of Two Cities. And so you read it and then watch the video if you want to do that. That's cool too. I really enjoy hearing from people who have walked through the whole series, and I just didn't know it till they got to the end and then left a note. Okay, so those are my thoughts. You do not need to read the classics to write well, but I think there is a lot to be learned from people who have stood the test of time, who have insights into humanity and ways of expressing those ideas in a way that's memorable. So yes, that's it. Make sure to like this video, subscribe if you're new. Thank you so much for being here. I have lots of videos on writing, publishing, and indie author life. Most of them are a lot shorter than this, but I was on a roll today. Okay, that's it. I will see you next week. Thanks for joining me.